Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International as we're getting ready for our Eastern Cup weekend here. We've previously seen how the West has done. Now, we're also going to be experiencing some more in terms of balance changes, class changes coming up, and we'll start seeing how that starts affecting the meta. Hey, I'm Jack, and joining me right now for our first series of the day, we've got Salute, Nagura, and Tettles. And friends, we mentioned it last week, and now we're going to be able to talk about it again here. We've had some pretty big nerfs coming in for the section for rogues in particular, but also a couple buffs for some of the other classes. So keep in mind, for these guys, Salute, we did see how balance changes are going to kick in this week, but previously they didn't affect Eastern time trials. So comfort level is going to be a big factor here. Yeah, comfort level will be a big factor, but you know, I think they're actually going to rely on that comfort level, and I don't think we'll see too many swaps coming out of the rogues. Just in general, going for a lot of these teams, I mean, we can see it on the screen right now. Outlaw Rogue got some fairly substantial buffs, but it really seems like a lot of the MDI vets feel that it's not enough to really put them out of the top. Rogues just bring too much to the table in terms of utility and just the kind of toolkit that they have. So it's very possible that we're going to see maybe, you know, I'd be shocked if we see teams with one Outlaw Rogue, but likely we're going to see some double Outlaw Rogue play with the usual, you know, throw a Windwalker in there. Unholy's huge right now. They just got a buff as well. So I don't think we're really out of the Outlaw woods just yet. And certainly between time trials and now, these teams haven't had the time to try and innovate just yet. That's true. That's a fair point as well. So as we take a look at our bracket and start seeing how our teams are getting themselves prepared for the week, Buff, War, Nerf, Rogue, of course, is going to be very excited about some of those class changes, as you mentioned there, Salute. We also see Team D, who is once again returning and one of the highest point holders as we're looking at them right now with 340 points. So great to see them back once again. We also have Black Mamba, who's a very familiar team, but Nagura, they did reform a lot of their rosters, so they're starting fresh with points here.
Yeah, so if you replace more than one of your members of your team, then you lose all of your points from the spring season. So therefore, Black Mamba is going to start with 0 points here, and they will have to fight their way back if they want to qualify for BlizzCon. Now, of course, the points are increased by 150% this time around in comparison to spring season, so they do have a good chance to still qualify.
They definitely do. And let's take a look at our schedule as we're getting ourselves ready for the day. As we mentioned previously, Buff, War, Nerf, Rogue is squaring off against One Last Chance. AAA versus Hypers, followed by Team D versus Team 430. Black Mamba and Full Speed with the double upper semis and the double lower rounds. The titles, we will be seeing a couple of elimination games coming into this one, but Buff, War, Nerf, Rogue, let's start focusing on them as we're getting ourselves ready for the matchup. They do have one new addition to the team, Supreme, who usually raids at Limit.
Yeah, he's actually been streaming a large amount of their time trials and stuff like that, and they were running some pretty unconventional stuff inside of like the tank roll. I know I saw them playing like Unholy DK, so it's definitely going to be interesting to see what Buff or Nerf Rogues ends up bringing to the table out of the first seed. I think it's I think there's a high chance of likelihood that we do end up seeing them play some unconventional stuff moving on to some of these other maps, though.
I don't know, we'll have to keep a close eye on for that one as we're looking at Tyrannical, Sanguine, and Explosive here for Ataldazar. And on this one, Salute, we've seen some Sanguine already with Ataldazar and how nasty it can be with some of the snap spots.
Yeah, Sanguini, Panini, Christina could be pretty rough, especially when you combine those snap spots. And if we see, you know, the big dino pull coming in from any of the teams as well, it gets pretty rough because as soon as you grab all the swords on top of the Screamers and you throw the dinos in there too, you have a very limited window in which you can actually sit on that snap spot. So it's going to cause a bit of kind of chaos within the teams if they're not well practiced with it.
And also a significant factor is with Beguiling. There's going to be 3 different focused weeks, whether it's the Arcane for the Enchanted Emissary, the Tides Emissary, or for the Void Emissary. So onto Ataldazar on this one, Tettles. I mentioned previously last week how none of the emissaries end up snapping with them, and this week is going to be on the Arcane Emissary. What are you thinking about that?
I mean, so just in general, Arcane Emissary for Ataldazar is actually a pretty easy pick just in general. So, like you said, because the emissaries don't actually snap into those spots, it makes it really easy for you to be able to deal with them, creating even more of a reason for you to look to snap a bunch of mobs into a spot there.
And at that point, all you have to be doing is putting out a couple of attacks here and there that the healer can easily deal with to continue knocking back that Enchanted Emissary and getting them taken care of without a problem. But we're all set and ready to go. So if you'd like to place your vote on who you think is going to be winning this first series, be sure to vote #Buff or #Last to place your vote as we're getting ourselves ready for the first game in the Eastern Cup in Ataldazar.
And no shock to see a bunch of rogues coming into the game. I mean, they did have those nerfs, and they were pretty substantial nerfs, but these teams, I mean, they did all of these maps, or practiced at least a lot of the maps before the nerf. So it's not too surprising to see here the triple rogue already coming out of One Last Chance, and of course from Buff War. But straight up to the side here they go as they get ready to do a pretty substantial pull. Of course, with Sanguine and Explosive on the board, we are in a Tyrannical Affix, so I'm not expecting this trash to provide too much issue for them off the bat.
Yeah, so there's one thing we actually saw from the Western region that people started doing at this huge pull to start, is that the healer was actually grabbing the Stalker, which patrols on the right side instead of this side, over on top of this pull, because Stalkers don't really do that much on top of this pull, so it's just extra little percentage that you can gain from that. We also see One Last Chance actually playing a Tree of Life, as you can see the Raster Druid there with Innervated up on this ledge, just spamming instant regrows.
Yeah, that's an interesting pick for them, but it works out as we get some chunking damage coming in here on the side of Buff Warrior. No problem for them as they heal up and start heading over towards the Construct side. A pretty popular strat that started to get a bit popularized in last season with Reaping, but especially with no Reaping and nerfs to that Construct itself. We see teams go up here. They still ignore the Construct, but they just go right up. They Shadow Meld on the side of Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue, and we're going to expect to see a pretty substantial pull coming out of them here as One Last Chance. Still struggling kind of to get that pack down. They finally managed to cleave it down. They do have the extra 2% that you mentioned, Nagura, from that Stalker as well, but it's spent quite a bit of time doing that, which unfortunately Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue has already moved up to Priestess Alunza's room and is already cleaving down the trash.
Yeah, so Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue popping that Bloodlust, as you mentioned, on this huge pull here. You see the Enchanted Emissary just being dealt with by the Raster Druid, by Loda. Now, one thing to note about the difference in speed is, I think it's probably the Sanguine that One Last Chance was not handling as well as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue did, because Sanguine placement is, of course, very important. And one more thing to note about the difference in composition is that the Windwalker provides that Ring of Peace, which definitely helps to deal with this all of this Sanguine on top of having that Typhoon from the rest.
Indeed, as a lot of damage coming in from that bursting on the team of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, barely being able to heal Ching BB up, but finally managing to stabilize as they look onto Priestess Alunza, getting ready to pull the first boss here. One Last Chance not too far behind here. Both teams flawless in their execution so far, and pretty similar strategies coming out of them as well, as we see that Bloodlust popped on the side of One Last Chance too. Priestess Alunza now has been pulled here, and I just want to note, of course, for those at home, we have finally added energy meters on the bosses, so you can see it down at the bottom of the screen, sub the boss's percentage. You will have an opportunity to see what these bosses do when they reach that 100 energy. Many different bosses have different abilities. In the case of Priestess Alunza here, once she reaches that 100%, you will cast the Transfusion that we're all so lovingly familiar with, where the team needs to soak up those red pools in order to be able to reflect the damage. Now, this ability as well, and some of her other AoE on this pack, not to mention Volcall Nagura, has been buffed. You can see just how much damage that did to the team, especially in this Tyrannical Affix.
Yeah, you can definitely see that the healers actually have to use their healing abilities instead of having to stay in cat form and do some damage instead. But we see Loda and Raynor actually dealing with this pretty well. Now, One Last Chance actually having some trouble, as you can see them drop very low here, as they did pull some trash on top of this boss here. Now, usually in the past, we've seen teams just pull the whole room on top of Priestess Alunza. But with Tyrannical and those boss buffs that we've seen, this is a lot more difficult now. And you can see One Last Chance actually struggle quite a bit. They did recover now, and they also have a battle rest ready to them, so in case something happens, they're still going to be fine. But the boss seems to be like not dropping HP. I'm not sure if they messed up their first Transfusion cast. I'm
not sure. Yeah, I didn't keep an eye on it either. They might have actually gotten sealed from the Sanguine, because she definitely did get a Transfusion by the time we kind of peeked back over to their sides. A lot of damage coming in here, and we have a death actually on Ken for One Last Chance. Finally, they get the battle res up. Not going to have that available again for about 6 minutes here, as they struggle with Priestess Alunza here. One of the bosses that was, I would reckon to say, one of the biggest joke bosses pre-buff. It really was a non-factor, but just packing a punch now for the teams after it got buffed post-Season 2 for all these players. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, though, not shying away from that as they managed to down that boss and head over towards the bridge overhanging, of course, Razan's pit at the bottom. They do a snap on the side here. Swords will need to be killed quickly, and then the Sky Screamer will need to be moved, but it looks like they're trying to focus it down as much as possible. They know the danger of Sanguine on the side. Immediately, Ching moves away as they kill one of the swords. It doesn't look like they really got the snap they wanted there. A couple of the swords were on the side, only one was with them, and they finally moved out, grabbed the second Screamer, and they missed the interrupt as the entire team gets feared. Fortunately, Ching does have that Berserking Rage available. She gets you out of fear on a 1-minute cooldown and pops Spell Reflect for some reason immediately after breaking out of that, so they do have to watch out for that. Already some sloppy play coming out of these two teams, Nagura.
Yeah, and one more thing to note here that the graphic actually is strong. It's sanguine and bursting and not explosive. So one more thing with these swords here, the swords don't have a lot of HP, right? But they do so much damage because they jump around constantly if you're not snapping them onto the spot here. So if you have the swords jump around and you also have bursting on top of that, it's definitely very difficult to deal with this affix here in Atelazar. That's why we don't see them snap multiple sword packs on top of each other, just because of this bursting affix making it so difficult. And of course sanguine as well. As Buffware Nerf Rogue jumps down, it pulls Razan.
Man, oh man, nothing but troubles here for one last chance. They're still fighting Priestess Alunza. She's healed, I think, twice over at this point. They just are, like, she's just not taking any damage. They seem to be screwing up the pools on the ground, which of course is absolutely crucial for reflecting upwards of 25% of her maximum HP every time she does a transfusion. So a lot of danger there, as Buffware and Nerf Rogue not shying away from it either. They pulled the Skyscreamer, as we typically see teams do, down to Razan right now. Now keep in mind, of course, we are on a Sanguini affix, so that Skyscreamer dies in the wrong spot against this boss that very frequently casts and stands still. They're going to have a very bad time, and we're going to get a lot of healing on these high health tyrannical bosses. But Razan here at 70%, just past 70%, 50% trash on the board for Buffware and Nerf Rogue. One last chance, just struggling through this. Finally, Priestess Alunza hitting 15% for them as they're 38% trash. They're just falling so far behind now.
Yeah, they're gonna need one more transfusion. I'm not really sure what happened, but one more thing to note as well is that the difference in composition, of course, it's just, you know, one more row compared to a Windwalker, but the Windwalker also provides more CC for this boss. For the Spirits of Gold that you can see, there's a seat in the background with that blind. Now, blind is the only rogue CC they can use on those, as of course you can't use Step on them, and blind has a limited duration and a longer cooldown. So Paralyzed is much better for that CC compared to that blind. But in the end, they managed to finally get it down. It probably was a mistake to just pull trash on top of the boss. It's just too much for them, as they took way too long to down this boss.
For some reason, the tank bleed goes on Spremis here on Buffware and Nerf Rogue. Takes a huge amount of damage, dips down to 1% HP. Fortunately for them, no proc on that cheat death. Not really sure how that happened, or if Ching maybe shadow held at the wrong time or something, but nonetheless, the tank debuff and hit went on one of the rogues, managed to survive it just fine as they get ready to down this Emissary of Ties that they pulled from the top. Just reminder for those, of course, the dungeons with this beguiling or bejeweling affix, as we call it, are heavily weighted towards one type, and in the case of Atelazar for these cups, we are in the arcane one. So you'll see the Tides and the Void being present in here, but you'll have a higher value or a higher concentration of arcane mobs. Of course, those are the beguiling mobs that require you to get them punted away and removed so that none of the mobs are getting reflected damage within their aura. Here we go again. Razan starts chasing Ching as the heroic leaps away. 15% left on the boss right now. Skyscreamer chasing him too, making sure that the rogues are on top of that for interrupts as well. As one last chance is looking one last time where to go.
Oh, so Ching actually charged in way too early and he got eaten by the boss. Now, if the tank actually gets fixated by the boss, then the fixate lasts a little bit longer than the animation and then the debuff, so you don't want to go in immediately. Sometimes you actually want to have your healer or one of your DPS taunt the boss if the healer gets fixated, just to prevent the tank from getting eaten. Now, Ching not actually caring too much, is charging back in and actually getting picked up by the boss, but they manage to out-heal it and Ching actually stays alive. Now, they're on their way to the next trash pack. Well, one last chance. They're not actually that far behind when it comes to trash percentage. They're only 3% behind, but they're struggling so much as their healer goes down. They're struggling with bursting. They're struggling with basically everything right now. They need to get their head back into the game if they want to beat Buffware and Nerf Rogue here.
Yeah, a lot of damage coming in on one last chance. They pulled the Void Emissary, something that Buffware and Nerf Rogue entirely omitted. Now, reminder, of course, of this Void Emissary is new for this season. It will stand planted in its area. You cannot move it. It's completely immobile, and it will just chain cast this huge shadow hit, which gives you a 12-second debuff that makes you take subsequent shadow hits from them for 50% increased damage, and it already does a ton of damage. You can see her here just chain wiping the group. They have 9 deaths on the board right now as the Rested Druid once again dies. Now, you can line of sight this mechanic, but it's better, honestly, at least in the form of racing here at the MDI, to just completely avoid these mobs. It is very time inefficient to deal with. They're extremely dangerous, and they just pack a punch for no reason, which is why you see teams just avoiding it. A lot of snapping coming in here right now. Somebody actually falls down there. One of the rogues, I believe, went down over the cliff.
It was the monk, unfortunately.
Oh, it was the monk.
But he should be able to get back up there. He is running back. Unfortunately, monk actually quite important to have here on this pool because it's a huge snapping pool that they did. It was actually the middle pack that they snapped on top. We see Supreme dropping very low, blocking the cheat death here as the tank Ching just walked away just to be aware that the Sanguine is not going to heal the rest of the mobs here. Very important. Morito actually going down as well. just as he got back.
Maybe he should have just stayed in Razan's pit because unfortunately he goes down coming back up. First death on the board here for Buffware and Nerf Rogue. They choose not to commit their battle risk to it, which they'll get another one up in just a few seconds as they are, of course, at the starter bridge just down the stairs from the dungeon. So he managed to just release and run down the stairs and continue to help the pack. But this is a sloppy pull from them coming in. Finally, they re-snap it to a clean position where there is no Sanguine and are looking to try and cleave these three mobs down together. Now, of course, this is a particularly dangerous pull. These deal a fair bit of damage, and they're just so mismanaged with their health right now because Dinomancer Keisho, of course, she does shoot from, she's a ranged mob that's not interruptible, so nobody's really paying attention to her as they were cleaving all the dinosaurs down. So they are now, of course, cleaving off of her. As you can see, her health going down much faster than two dinos. One Last Chance has a bit of a dynamite problem of their own as they've gone downstairs in the Razan pit with the same pull and no snapping. They're just slowly backpedaling as the team just losing a fair bit of health here.
So this strategy that One Last Chance is using here is actually kind of difficult to pull off because of the Sanguine and the bursting. So I believe what they want to do is pull this on top of Restan. So we saw them snap the middle pack onto one of the ledges, and then they all jump down, actually engaging Restan here. They do not have ballast available to them, but this is a strategy we've seen from the Western region last weekend. So probably just copying this, which is very efficient, of course, to deal with all of this trash while fighting Restan. But they've struggled before, and they already have 9 deaths on the board, so they need to make sure that they pull this off cleanly, because a wipe on a boss like this is definitely going to cost them a lot of time.
A lot of time, and there were already 9 deaths versus Buffware's Rogue 1 death. That's 40 seconds extra on the board that they're going to have to overcome in this not very clean run that we're seeing here from One Last Chance. Certainly not as clean as Buffware and Nerf Rogue, who's had a bit of woes on their own. They, of course, CC'd this Emissary of Tides on the side, who has come in just a bit early, and she does prevent all forms of crowd control and interrupt for any surrounding mobs, so they're not going to be able to interrupt these Sky Screamers if they don't kill them quickly enough. But they managed to do just that as the Emissary goes down as well, and they get ready for an Arcane or Enchanted Emissary pull. Up ahead, as you can see, you want to make sure that they are put out of the group, else they will reflect 200% damage. Ching heroic leaps in right past the Emissary as they start bumping the Emissary backwards. Now, you can, of course, punt them away with any direct damage, which is what you're seeing the team do here. Good shockwave coming in here from Ching BB to make sure that both of those area denials, of course, the damage reduction zones are handled.
Yeah, so I'm actually kind of impressed by Buffware and Nerf Rogue here. They're doing a really fast attack here. They only have 1 death. Of course, they struggled a little bit with this middle snapping pull that they did earlier. But other than that, they had a very clean run so far. They also seem to be having a very fast and clean strategy as well, which it's not being copied from the Western region either. They did have their own strategy, of course, except going left side up to Priestess first, which is something that everyone in the MDI has adapted, basically. So very impressed by Buffware and Nerf Rogue as they reach 100% enemy forces and are on their way to Volcal here.
Volcal coming up soon as one of the shrouds get put up right away for Buffware and Nerf Rogue. They sneak in past the trash just on the outside. Of course, no Void Emissary in this build here. Sometimes you do get a Void right outside of this room. It's quite mean on live servers, but no worry for the team here as they start phase 1 of Volcal, making sure that these 3 reanimated totems are, of course, killed at the same time within that 5 or 6 second cast. One Last Chance still chiseling away on Razan. They did manage to pull off that rather difficult pull that you mentioned earlier, Nagura, so kudos to them as Razan does hit 33% now. They're sitting at 75% trash, but fair ways behind Buffware and Nerf Rogue, which is at 100% trash and working on their 3rd or 4th boss. Volcal, similar to Priestess Alunza, was one of the bosses that was actually buffed. You can see the amount of HOTS healing over time and attention that the group is getting here on the side of Buffware and Nerf Rogue along the top of the screen. When our beautiful observers, of course, select one of the active players in the group, you can see what kind of buffs they've given to the rest of their group. In this case, a lot of healing pumping out of Loda right now to make sure that they can handle this recently buffed Volcal boss.
Yeah, we also see, of course, we don't want to talk about comp too much just because we saw the rogue nerfs come in, but we still see all of these rogues. Now, we talked about this in the pre-show. Slut mentioned that the reason why they're still running so many rogues is not only because the rogue maybe didn't affect it too much because of utility-wise, but also because the Eastern region actually was playing the time trials last weekend before those nerfs actually affected those groups. So some of the teams do not have time to practice other comps or switch out their rogues for other classes, so they just stick to the comps that they're being used to. Well, Buffware and Nerf Rogue is playing this Monk, of course, to buff everyone else's damage, which is something we've seen a lot in the spring season, of course. Well, One Last Chance just stuck to the same comp they were playing in the time trials.
I like this position here from Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue. It's the small things that matter. They're nicely spread out around the ball so you don't get too many puddles. You can see Tomboys there on the side, and you can see Supreme on the other side, just making sure that they spread out the puddle drops and not clip too many players with each other. Supreme just taking a bit of damage here. Of course, they do not have a disease dispel outside of the Monk right now, who managed to just get one off, but I mean, DPS Brain Nagura, they're not going to use a precious GCD for dispelling one of their safe members of the team. They just want to get as much damage out as possible, forcing poor Loda to heal through it. As we can see, he actually does dispel himself greedily enough, but they do manage to keep going here. Ching just dropping a bit low, but no problem. His Volcall should be falling here soon. One Last Chance is dealing with their own snapping on the side, doing well on top of it, but a lot of bursting damage coming in on team right now as we get a cheat death proc on Rogue, and Charis finally manages to hang on. A lot of healing coming in from Anons. A bit of mismanagement there with bursting for the swords.
Yeah, one more thing to note about this Tree of Life is, of course, it's an extra cooldown they can use for those big bursting pulls, but it just seems like that they're struggling with bursting so much in between because you constantly have a lot of bursting stacks with those swords. And Tree of Life does have a 3-minute cooldown, so in between those 3 minutes, you're missing out on Cultivation, on another buff that you could have for those kind of healings. So interesting choice here by One Last Chance, probably because of those huge pulls that they were planning on doing with Priestess Illumines and Resan, so where they were pulling the trash on top of the boss. So they wanted to have this Tree of Life extra cooldown for these huge pulls. Didn't really work out for them as well, especially the Priestess room. I think that's where they lost the most time. And then, of course, the wipes that they had where they just kept dying over and over to the Void Emissary. Outside of that, you know, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue 100%, and they're on Yasma pulling their Bloodlust here.
Nice view, of course. Once again, I'll draw attention to it. The energy bar at the bottom of the screen is now available for bosses. Once Yasma reaches 100 energy, we do know she does this cast on the group with the Soul Rend, popping all of the images out, which the team needs to cleave down before they reach the boss. We've seen, of course, that 100 times. Important to note as well, Loda does not have staff available for another 5 minutes. So procced it earlier, I believe, during the trash leading up to Volcall. So staff, very common piece that a lot of healers are wearing. Comes, of course, from the Ashara Raid that came out in patch 8.2 for World of Warcraft. Yasma here, 66% for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. Bloodlust is just about to fall off here for them. And I mean, they're just well ahead. There's no way One Last Chance is catching up on this one, Nagura.
I mean, unless they have multiple full team wipes, which is very unlikely, but it could happen. No, after all.
Why are you happy at this thought?
Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue dealing with the Soul Rend very easily, as you can see. The closer you put the Soul Rend to the boss, the riskier it is, because of course if the Soul Rend reaches the boss, you get the debuff applied to the whole group that stacks and does damage over time. But the closer you have them, the more damage you're going to do, the more efficient it's going to be for a boss DPS. So that's why those teams, of course, are practiced well enough to be able to put the Soul Rend very close to the boss and just use some sort of AoE stuns or Ring of Peace, as we've seen on the last Soul Rend, or Typhoon, Vortex, and so on. There's all this utility they can use to prevent those ads from reaching the boss. But we've seen some teams in the spring season make mistakes and actually them raging. So we'll see how Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue is going to finish this boss here.
Yeah, it should be no problem for them. I mean, that Soul Rend applies every 30 seconds, so rotation between Typhoon, which is 30-second cooldown. Actually, you can Typhoon every wave, and Ring of Peace itself, along with Leg Sweep, should be just enough for them to handle. But Yasma here, 15%, One Last Chance still, 9 deaths on the board. Volcall, phase 2 just started for them at 93%. It looks like Buff Warriors dealt with their final Soul Rend here, and they'll be just finishing the boss off in a moment. But, you know, this is, I guess, what you kind of expect to see from the seeding that was available after we saw it. There's a bit of a division between the top 4 and the bottom 4, and here it is, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue comfortably taking the first game. But One Last Chance will have one last game coming up in just a moment, Jeff.
Yeah, before they go into the potential lower bracket, and they have one last chance there?
Yeah, well I think, in my professional opinion, that we'll revisit this joke a few times.
I'd say that's an astute observation, Slew. Thank you so much for that one. So Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, our #1 seed on this one, Tattles, handily takes that Ataldazar. And, for example, they have, what, 14-minute difference, for example, in time trials? There's a massive difference between these teams thus far, and it really showed here.
Yeah, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue really showing why they are the #1 seed, but they did still have some pretty unconventional errors inside of this Ataldazar. Like bursting plus Sanguine is actually pretty dangerous. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue's first major pull of the instance, of course, is like this Alloons of Trash, and they actually end up dealing with it pretty well. They end up having a really nice Typhoon and a really nice Ring of Peace there. that made sure the mobs didn't actually end up healing from Sanguine. While One Last Chance, whenever they actually do make their way to Priestess Alunza, you can actually see that yellow, that goldish line actually coming out of the boss there, healing it. So they actually spent a large amount of time with the transfusion heal on Priestess Alunza. So those were two major differences between One Last Chance and Buff War Nerf Rogue. In addition to that, Buff War Nerf Rogue here, with the Monk falling off the edge, he ends up like dying to bursting, I think, off to the side, or ends up sacrificing himself to the pack. And then Buff War Nerf Rogue, whenever the Sards actually die from the Dinomancer pack, the Dinomancer actually sits in that snap spot for a prolonged period of time, just healing that pack up to full and costing Buff War Nerf Rogue a pretty sizable amount of time. Bursting plus Sanguine actually ends up costing you a ton of time in a Taldazar just in general, so Buff War Nerf Rogue ended up taking it pretty slow and ended up getting like somewhere in the range of about 18 minutes in this dungeon, whereas for a point of reference, West Cups ended up having this dungeon done in about 15-ish minutes. So while the fixes are significantly more challenging for Buff War Nerf Rogue, I don't know if it was necessarily like a 3-minute differential.
You'd also have to take into account the Outlaw Rogue nerfs as well, because this is going to be the experience of all of that damage being nerfed down a little bit. So, I mean, so it was mentioned before, there's so much good utility out of Rogues already, but when you start taking, the nerf bat to the knees of Blade Flurry, it's going to have some effects.
I just don't, I mean, we know, Jackie and I, we all know a lot of top players on live that have been, very prominent with their classes over time. And, we keep coming back, for instance, this Frost DK thing, right? We talked to Tegu a lot. You guys know Tegu. I mean, Frost DKs are crazy on live right now. Unholy DKs can be crazy on live right now. So is Outlaw Rogue the best consistent AoE DPS at all times for all these dungeons? Probably not anymore after the nerf, I'm willing to say. But the kind of synergy and the practice that these teams have, plus all the utility that comes out of Rogues, is just so hard to say no to Rogue.
Yeah, especially because if you're used to a strategy, let's say you're in Underrod, in Krogma's room, where you need all these single target interrupts, right? And you're used to having those rogues dealing with this, and this other rogue deals with the other mob. And then once you switch this up, you don't have the rogue for all of this utility anymore, and all of a sudden you need to change up your strategy, which is going to cost a lot of time. And they don't have a lot of time to practice for these cups in general.
We'll have to see. I mean, we have expanded, for example, the time trial period, so you're having that 5-day period to start practicing instead of the 3. But as we mentioned, going into this, we had the expectation that there's not going to be as much time for them to take a look at those things and start adjusting some of their composition. So we'll have to see how that grows, because there is some rumors of Game 2 titles. Actually, we'll hold off at that point.
Hey,
there is some
spoilers.
rumors of Game 2 that some interesting things will be happening. So don't go anywhere, guys. Game 2 coming up on the other side of this break. Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International, as Buff War Nerf Rogue got its wishes with class changes, but let's see if they get their wish as we're getting ourselves ready to go in game number 2 against One Last Chance at 88%. Chat in favor of Buff War Nerf Rogue, our number 1 seed, as we're getting ourselves started in Borealis.
I mean, I'm really shocked to see this 88%. There's just a dominant win by them. They are the first seed right now, so very much expected that this team will come up. And, the only thing I'm getting that I like here is the fact that there's a Vengeance Demon Hunter on the board, and it's from Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, so something that they're clearly practiced with. Both teams out the gate with Alliance, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see here. Yes, indeed. They both have those Shadow Melds coming up, so we do know Vengeance Demon Hunters can be Night Elves. In fact, they can only be Night Elves on Alliance, so interesting to see what comes out of them. Vengeance in general as a spec is a bit on the up and coming on live right now, especially with the new Essence system that's come out. They have some nice, a nice new build to it, but I do believe Ching, I'll have to check in a bit, is probably still running the typical Spirit Bomb build, as it's just the highest DPS, and on a 17 at their gear level right now, Nagura, really not too dangerous.
Yeah, so in case you didn't know, purple is actually my favorite color, so I'm going to be super biased towards Buff War Nerf Rogue in this game here, as they actually popped their Bloodlust and have a huge pull here coming in as the Vengeance Demon Hunter pops his meta, which does look beautiful, by the way. Doing a really good job dealing with these mobs here, as the Siege, of course, it's Fortified, Skittish, and Necrotic. Now, Necrotic, something I asked Loot before if Vengeance Demon Hunters are even good for Necrotic, and he said not really, but so they must have some other plan with this Vengeance Demon Hunter if Necrotic is not the reason for them to play it.
I mean, they're just equally as bad as Warrior, Necrotic. They're both just not good tanks against Necrotic. Now, Warrior has a bit of an advantage in the sense that, it's a higher mitigation tank and less reliant on self-sustain, which can be huge coming out of Vengeance Demon Hunters in general. But, we'll see. It could be something to do with their Sigil of Chains, the AoE grip that they have. We know how advantageous those can be in some areas. So far, so good for them right now. 8% trash on the border. They're still working on the final Emissary of Tides in front of, I believe, the first boss is, just in there, Chopper Red Hook. They're getting ready now to get started on this first boss. We are in a fortified environment, so the bosses will be a bit easier than we saw on the previous map on Natal, and we are in Necrotic, as Nagur mentioned, and, you know, we have Skittish, really not a big deal. Vengeance Demon Hunters can actually output a fair bit of damage, just like Prot Warriors, especially with the Spirit Bomb build. I promised you, Chad, I will have a check on the build in a second here, but on top of it, you have Rogues with Misdirect, so really not a concern for any of these tanks right now, as they already get started on the first boss. One last chance. Looks like they're dealing with a lot of the trash instead of skipping it at the beginning of the dungeon for Alliance.
Yeah, it seems like one last chance definitely behind in trash and also behind in time, as they haven't engaged the first boss yet. Now this first boss, as you mentioned, should not be as difficult, but one thing to note here is that of course those mobs that Jing is tanking right now do apply necrotic, so it is a little bit of a problem if you have lots of them up. And one downside for Alliance is you actually continuously have those ads spawn throughout the fight, even if they're still alive from the previous ad wave, while on Horde side they actually stop spawning if you just see them somewhere. But Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue dealing with it really well and finishing off the first boss.
Yeah, so one last chance here. Just still working on the trash right now. It seems they have a bit of MIA with the healer, so we're keeping an eye on that. But Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue has dealt with the first boss here as they moved over to the side and have now collected a large amount of mobs. A lot of necrotic stacking up on Ching right now, who has once again access to that meta. I do believe he's playing, looks like kind of a gluttony build with perhaps Visions, which is what we've seen popularized or are seeing popularized on live right now. But nonetheless, no problem for them as they chew through that trash and start to head off. But it looks like we are likely going to have a bit of a restart on the match right now.
Yep, we're checking in and making sure we're able to start seeing what's going on, as one last chance's Rested Druid's been having some issues, so we want to be able to see what is happening on that end, and we will be pulling out of game right now. If it's coming into an issue where the character is unable to log in, but their internet and all of their other settings, everything are good, then it looks like we might be having to go towards a remake. So they're checking in on that right now. And Tattles, we got to see a little bit of the Vengeance Demon Hunter. We haven't quite seen some of those larger pulls yet at the end of the instance.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting to see what they actually did right in front of the first boss in Borealis. The Vengeance Demon Hunter ended up getting pretty high on necrotic stacks. I think he was somewhere in the range of like 28 to 29, getting closer to the point where you actually end up becoming unhealable. He was still just like standing there DPSing, not looking to kite, so that was actually very impressive of them. They also ended up using Ring of Peace to knock the tides out of that pack, so a lot of very interesting strategy stuff coming out of the side of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue there.
It sounds interesting. Like, the thing is, there's another tank here.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Vengeance for a bit.
Yeah.
One of the big things with Vengeance from last season is that an 8.2 got a pretty substantial buff to meta. Meta is their big cooldown for those at home that they use, and which is why one of the builds that's coming up with Gluttony and Visions is getting very popular right now. But when you're in meta, because of the buffs they gave, you're basically indestructible. Mm-hmm. And because of the scaling, Vengeance Demon Hunters have the highest health scaling of all the tanks. So at the gear level they're at, probably in meta form, they're running at around 1 million health. So when you pop meta, they're just indestructible. So that's why you're like, wow, it was really cool to see. I was like, who cares, man? Yeah, you have 1 million HP. You have high, like, ridiculous amounts of armor too. So Vengeance can certainly have these moments, a lot of pumper moments.
So you mentioned, are they running with Vision of Perfection as that major essence?
I'm not sure if they're running with, the Vision's Gluttony build is a lower DPS build, but very high survivability because you get fairly frequent procs. We're talking 35 to 45% meta uptime per dungeon, which is a lot, and we just said how indestructible meta is. But the thing with this is it is lower damage, and we're in a race environment here, so they might be sticking with a more typical Spirit Bomb build here just to maximize damage with Enema of Death as their primary. Enema of Death, of course, hits everything around you for 10% max HP, scaling reverse. So if you have a tank that has 1 million health, you pop meta and you pop Anima, and then the trash just gets obliterated every 2 minutes. So I haven't had a chance yet to look at the build, so when we jump back in game, I'll check it out and see what he's running exactly. But it was looking pretty cool so far from the start.
A higher DPS build will also help with Skittish as well, just making sure that you actually are able to keep threat. Double Rogue, though, I mean, you should be good to keep threat with just double Tricks of the Trade. So the Vengeance Demon Hunter maybe playing for more DPS with the race environment also does make sense on Skittish week, even if you aren't running Double Rogue, right?
Yeah, should make a lot more sense onto that one. But we have seen some of the Western Demon Hunters come up last week. What were you thinking in terms of the differences in builds? Because you said, I think it was last week, they were running with those high DPS builds.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of makes sense. Those are basically the two main builds. You might have a couple of small off-spec things between either the Vision's Gluttony build with crazy meta uptime or just the higher damage build with Spirit Bomb. Last week you saw Spirit Bomb being run, and that's just part of the fact, like I was talking to Gura, I mean, these are 17s. they have 445 eye level. The chances of a tank, unless you pull half the dungeon, in which case you're probably planning for it with high CDs, high healing uptime, is just something that these, these tanks are not too worried about right now. They're running pretty offensively, except for the trinkets.
Yeah, one more thing to note is, if you talk about damage versus survivability for tanks, is of course the longer you can stay in a trash pool, the more damage you're going to do. So even if you do more damage, if you're less tanky and you have to leave the pool earlier and you have to start kiting, then you always have to look at the pros and cons, because the longer you stay in, the more damage you do.
And it's not even for yourself as the tank, but as soon as you start running away, it just causes confusion and havoc as the melee are trying to run around. A caster starts to lag in the back while the melee follows the tank, and you have a spread. It's a common problem that we mentioned last season, if you guys remember, in Motherlode, when we had those pulls with like 7 peacekeepers, and we're like, wow, what a bold pull. But then, cue Benny Hill music, they're just running around. they're just running around in circles.
Can we have that as a montage, please?
They're just running around in circles for what seemed like 6 minutes long, because one peacekeeper would cast, and then 3 of them would be in the middle, and then 2 of them would be at the tank, and you have a bunch of melee, and they're like, I don't know what to do right now. Like, what am I supposed to hit? They're all spread out. So, it is. You make a very good point. The tank being able to just face tank and sit in there is a fairly substantial damage game.
And that's also why Prot Warrior is still so popular, even with the damage nerfs, right? Because they're just so tanky and they can just stand inside and just keep tanking them, while other tanks maybe have to leave way earlier and causing all of this confusion.
TK. What was that, Sloop? Did you need a tissue or a cough drop?
Yeah.
And other forms of lozenges are available, of course.
Yes, the buff lozenges. Those are the best kinds of them all.
Oh, we're getting all kinds of buff lozenges coming up for Buff War and Nerf Rogue on that end.
That's true.
Yeah, at one point we might actually start seeing a little bit of differences, a little bit of changes coming around.
I mean, it's going to take, somebody needs to pioneer forth a different meta. Joke, haha, Vengeance Demon Hunter meta. But somebody needs to start pioneering. I'm not talking about just tanking, right? I mean, we talked about DKs for DPS. On the healer front, Jack.
Zmock did a little bit.
That's more your territory. Holy Paladin, maybe we'll see, maybe we won't. I know we saw a couple of Holy Paladins last week as well.
Mistweaver.
Mistweaver, yeah, we saw Mistweaver as well. So it's going to take some of these top teams to start innovating and pushing forth with new tunes, new builds, new classes, and show it. Or, on the flip side, it's going to take a team to use some of those new builds, push a new meta, and beat some of the better teams with it. That's what we need to see in order to start moving forth with the new meta. 3 rogues right now, post-nerf. Not really convinced it's still the best for every dungeon.
I don't think so either. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think we're all in agreement that we actually don't think it's the best. I think it just ends up coming down to like how much time, practice, and like how much innovation you can actually get from like looking at what other people are actually doing with the comps. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have just a ton of time to be able to put forth and practice, you may as well just try to be the best copycat team.
Yeah, and at that point, everyone's kind of looking at Method EU and seeing how they can start copying them and play around them. But it's also a little bit of a weird mentality as well, Suit, because you're just looking to copycat to be able to play second or third place, not first.
Yeah, I mean, this is just some Tettles the Weasel strategies coming in right here.
Just gonna call me a weasel, man.
Oh. What are you thinking? Tettles able to multi-class, Luke? Come on.
No, I mean,
You said it yourself.
Oh, man. I didn't know it was barbecue season already, but we're roasting Tettles as we speak.
He can't even multi-spec. He can't even play wrestling.
There's a reason I'm on the desk, okay?
But jokes aside, Tettles does make a very good point in that you have very limited time to practice, and when you're already so well-versed with these 2 to 3 rogue comps, you got to be as efficient as possible. If that means looking at and it's not just about specs, all right? Let's calm down, Twitch Dad. It's not Tettles. Leave poor Tettles alone. But the truth is, right? I mean, we saw this in the last cup too. Which team was it? Was it Team D that innovated the massive pull in Waycrest Manor and Rawls?
And then all of a sudden stealing it.
Yeah, and all of a sudden the West teams all started using it. So I mean, you got to take advantage where you can and be efficient about it to try and be the best.
Without a question. And now we're getting ourselves ready to get back into Siege of Borealis. Unfortunately, the Rested Druid for one last chance was having a bug that was making him unable to zone into the instance. That triggered a remake, so they're all good to go. We're all set and ready. Let's get into Borealis.
And guess what, Jack? The Rested Druid is indeed joining his team right now. Tayroke dipping quite low, not to the favoritism of that Rested Druid right now. Not like
he should heal him.
He should heal him. That is what healers do, or they're supposed to, Jack. You should take a note from that right now. But for a Nerf Rogue, once again, still running with that Vengeance Demon Hunter. We'll have to see exactly if they can manage to maintain that kind of prowess that they were having in the previous dungeon. One last chance following suit. And it seems like they're doing kind of the same thing that we saw in the last dungeon, even the healer here. They seem to be liking to pull a lot of this early trash.
Yeah, this is also something we've seen on the spring final, actually, in Australia. We've seen those teams run Alliance and just jump down and do all this trash on the Horde way. So, of course, Horde and Alliance start on different points here in Siege of Borealis, but as Alliance, you can actually jump down from the top of your starting point and do all of this trash here early. So what we've seen a lot of teams doing is kind of do this matter load strategy, where you do a lot of trash before you even reach the first boss. But this time around, we of course have completely different affixes compared to last time. And one more change happened with the spotters. They're not able to damage the last boss's tentacles anymore. So of course the strategy from the spring final in Australia is not really something you should be using anymore, except this trash here at the start, as we see One Last Chance doing. Now Buff Warrior Nurbrok have done the same exact big pull at the very start, but this time around they did not use their Bloodlust, which is very interesting because the last time they figured they need it, but this time around they're like, you know what, we don't actually need this Bloodlust, just to save it.
Just to save it, yeah. And I mean, you know, we've seen a lot of the dangerous trash, especially in this dungeon, come towards the end of the dungeon. We saw just how dangerous some of those pulls were for Method NA, for instance. Actually, a bunch of teams that did that pull last time. It was a very unstable, very scary pull, but if you're able to master it and pull it off like Method NA did last week, it is a huge time advantage, and that's part of the reason why Method NA was the dominant team in the previous week. Bit of trouble coming in here as I see you gawk at the screen for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue right now, Nagura.
It's actually a very risky play here by Loda, as you get the very first fixate by the boss. Those bombs that you need to kite the boss into are just about to spawn while you're getting fixated. So if you get a bomb spawn very close to you, you're going to be able to kite the boss back into a bomb. But if you don't, if the bombs are really far away, then you might get the hooking, this kind of ability that you want to avoid. Now Loda saw a bomb spawning, but the boss is very close to him, so he was like circling around the bomb. He still got hit, a melee hit by the boss. He went in bear form immediately though to make sure he's going to survive, and used his bark skin as well. So very well done by Loda here, surviving and also cutting the boss into a bomb.
Yeah, so I managed to finally have a bit of a sneaky peeky here at Ching's build, and he's actually kind of running a halfway build between the two that I was talking about earlier. So he is using Spirit Bomb, but he's actually using Visions as his major. Visions, of course, giving you the random procs for that meta form. Not nearly as prominent meta procs as combining it with Gluttony, but it is still working out for him. We've seen a couple of random meta procs here, and he's also running a fairly offensive build in terms of trinkets. Double offensive trinkets here, one on use, and of course Harlan's loaded dice that we see coming out of Freehold. So he's using Harlan's and of course the on use, as I mentioned, the plumage, whereas most tanks in the meta last week were running double defensive for the most part. They were running Edict, pretty much every tank was running Edict, and for the most part you had Urchin as well. Some tanks would run an offensive, maybe Gore Butcher's block there for some of the warriors, but really offensive build coming out here from Ching, almost fully offensive. He would have to use Anima instead of that Visions, but opting for just a bit of survivability, I suppose.
So one more difference to note here in Siege as well between Alliance and Horde is that you don't actually have those gatherers that, you know, give this free percentage on the Horde side because they're fighting each other. All you have to do is tag them, and then they kill each other, and they give you the extra percentage for the enemy forces, which the Alliance side does not actually have. So they have to kill a little bit more trash here as Ching jumps in with his meta form. Now on this point they do have a spotter, as you can see those artillery spawn for. You want to make sure that you tag all of the mobs before you kill them with the spotter though, because if you don't tag them you don't actually get the percentage from it. So it's very important that you pay attention to that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting here. Their strategies, they actually let Ching go ahead by himself and grab the trash, and he was the one getting the artillery strikes from the spotter. So it was actually the tank that was just unloading everything on top of the trash. Then the rest of the group joined after that. Of course, he would just Infernal Strike pack to pack. So really clever play from them here, just making sure that they were able to easily concentrate on top of the tank as opposed to having the melee be out of position or run around in a bad position from the start. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, excuse me, of course now at 32% trash, looking to move over to the second boss worth of trash. A bit of a running around in circles. They're not really sure what they were doing. Miscommunication on what they wanted to do or where they wanted to go, as one of the mobs was still alive. I believe the spotter in the back. One last chance now, 22% on the board, and they're still looking to pull some extra trash here as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue already making their way to the second boss's room.
Yeah, this actually cost them quite a bit of time, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, as they were missing one of those Marauders in the back, didn't kill them with the artillery and didn't tag them at all. So they had to go back to kill it because, of course, those teams, they're gonna pre-organize their routes and their strategy, and they want to get to 100% enemy forces. They don't want to kill more or less trash, of course. They want to hit exact 100% enemy forces. And if there's a mob that you planned on killing but you skip, then you have to just go back and kill this exact mob. So losing quite a bit of time here, but they, of course, are playing against the 8th seed, so they're probably comfortable in their strategy and comfortable to just go back and finish this off as they're fighting the second boss here.
Coming from a lot of damage coming in on Sharks right now for one last chance, as we do know those Marauders have Curse Strike on the tank, combined with Necrotic Strike makes makes quite dangerous. You can see the tank dipping to 5% health there. The healer, of course, was out of commission as they had died earlier. 2 deaths on the board right now. Finally gets back in and starts healing up the rest of this group as they look to finish off the trash. Big damage coming in there on Ken right now as they manage to heal the Rogue back up from 5% as well. Really shaky play here from one last chance. Just a lot of spot spike damage and a couple spot deaths. So you can see there 2 on the board mentioned earlier. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue looking in a much better prime position as they pull in some more of the Marauders on the side once Ching manages to reset those Necrotic Strikes. And now Ching is playing Undulating Tides on this boss. It's a bit of a question mark for me. That's a 45-second cooldown if you proc below 50% HP, so it's a bit of a dead talent when that happens. And on something like the tank in Necrotic Dungeon, you're probably going to have that happen, but perhaps he couldn't match any better pieces with his Azerite traits that were available on that tournament realm. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue now dealing with what I suspect will be their last transition here, probably Nagura, as the Cannoneer comes down and the boss, Captain Lockwood, is of course at 30% HP.
Yeah, if you can skip one whole transition or intermission phase here on Captain Lockwood, of course it saves you so much time, just because the boss jumps away and you have to deal with all these trash with the Cannoneers in the meantime. A little bit less time on the 45 setting, but still quite important to get one less intermission off here. Now, I'm very interested to see, or excited rather, to see what exactly Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue is going to do right after this boss, because last weekend we've seen the Western teams deal with all of the trash between this boss and the next boss in only 2 pulls. They were pulling almost half the dungeon together and dealing with it with the spotter. But on the Eastern weekend, they don't have Raging. The Raging affix was actually helping the Western teams last time around because the spotter's artillery damage is getting increased by the Raging affix, while Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue in the Eastern region does not have this Raging available to them here.
Yeah, one last chance here, 37% right now, and the Raging certainly not as dangerous, but there's going to be a lot of pressure Nagura on the tank with Necrotic in that last area, because part of the issue is, or part of the advantage, I suppose, that Avengers Demon Hunter and a Pro Warrior have with Necrotic, and they're not exactly the best tanks for it in the first place, is that they can go, uh-oh, my Necrotic stacks are high, I'm leaping out of here immediately. But where they do the trash for the third boss, where they do that mass pull with the spotter, there's not a lot of room to run, not to mention that the commanders don't get slowed or CC'd. So they could just ride their little horsies right up to the tank again and refresh that Necrotic stack. So it's going to be particularly dangerous as Marito, I think, gets hit by one of the artillery strikes there, dips him below 10% HP, finally getting some healing support from Loda, but he knows he is safe outside of that. So he's trying to vivify himself. I'm sure he's going to be quite mad at his healer later for not supplying that healing. Mori, unfortunately, using 4 GCDs there just to top himself off the vivify as the rest of the mobs come in. Emissary is rooted in the back there so that they can have access to interrupts on the Tempest right now.
Yeah, so the damage deal is actually having some problems here, as Marito got hit by the Fear, by the Demolisher, and Supreme got hit by one of the Bananas. So they want to make sure that they avoid all of these mechanics here. As you see on one last chance side, we actually have a death coming in on the Rogue here. We'll see if the Rest Druid manages to get a rest off here. He might be in combat still and not be able to get the rest off. As Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue definitely pulled a little bit slower than what we've seen from the Western region, but they're pretty far ahead at this point.
I just saw Loda slip on a banana there in the artillery strike coming down, and I was like, oh no, he's about to die. But of course, that was completely intended that he slipped on that banana. We do know that Loda has a potassium deficiency, so you just wanted to make sure to get that in when they had a bit of time between trash packs. No death there, and the situation actually gets even worse by what Nagura is saying. Not only did we have the spot death for one last chance, but I think we have a full team wipe. There are 2 deaths, now they're at 7, and it looks like one of the rogues is dead. Took a while to res here, so just a bunch of mishmash issues coming in for one last chance. I guess you could just see the practice levels between the 2 teams right now. You have the 1st seed versus the 8th. 8th is just not as well practiced. The rogue is still dead on the ground. They still have a battle res available. Not really sure what's going on. Another cheat death prog coming in here for one of their rogues. None of the rogues have cheat death available. Huge amounts of damage. Undulating Tides is already proc here for the Druid, so pretty sketchy for them as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue here chewing through the rest of their trash, trying to chew through the rest of the trash. 52% on the board. Another Undulating Tides proc for the tank, but Ching goes down, and it looks like trouble in disaster here as the two rogues proc cheat death. Actually, excuse me, only Tomboy proc cheat death, but Suprema's in a bit of an issue too as Morito runs away as well. And Loda just doing what he can, but a lot of struggle here, Nagura.
I think this is the reason why they are running the Vengeance Demon Hunter, or a big reason at least. We've seen this a very interesting strategy that we're trying to pull off. So they were pulling a lot of Buccaneers together, they were kiting it around the corner, and then we had the AoE fear from Ching come in. No one was touching those ads. They were just standing there being feared, and then they were waiting for the artillery from the spotter to come in, and they wanted to have the artillery kill them before they're going to cause any trouble. But then they were missing a couple of artilleries, and they didn't die in time like they probably practiced it, and then everything was going out of control as Ching had too many necrotic stacks, wasn't able to tank it anymore, and the damage dealers couldn't do as much damage because, of course, the Buccaneers are the ones who are throwing around the bananas, and it's super difficult for those melees to keep doing damage when this is happening. So having a lot of trouble here, but they managed to finish it off now.
This is a very scary pull. I know exactly what they're trying to do here. They're trying to kill off these snipers with the artillery strikes before they get any substantial damage in on the group. Of course, you can see all forms of crowd control coming up here. We have two saps, we have a paralyze in as well, and one of them is being tanked off the side. But here they go. They're finally activated. Ricochets go off on the group. You can see why they're so dangerous and why teams at all costs just try to make sure that they interrupt and keep those snipers crowd controlled until they're about to die. Those ricochets do immense amounts of damage, especially in this fortified environment. And here it is finally, Nagura. We get to see what they're going to do with this massive pull and how they're going to handle it. Emissary of Tide's already sapped here for the side of Buffware and Oak Grove for Tomboys, as Supremus is likely running off. We can see another sap in the distance, so Supreme Uwu has indeed sapped the second one. Big pull coming in here. It looks like they're going to do... Oh, okay, I thought they were going to do it with the boss in the room, but never mind. Here comes the big pack. Necrotic is to be kept an eye on here for the tank right now, as those commanders are particularly dangerous. We already have a Ring of Peace Denial to make sure that they can round up all the mobs. Sigil of Chains goes down, and as does a Sigil of Fear to make sure everything is grouped up together. And here comes the spotter artillery strike right on top of that nice little pile. Commanders have been taken out of the group on purpose. They're not affected or hit by the artillery strike coming in. This is really nice coming out of them.
Yeah, this is exactly what they were trying to do with the Buccaneers earlier, and this is the reason for this Vengeance Demon Hunter with the AoE grip and the AoE fear coming through. Now, of course, they were three-manning this as both of the rogues were back into the room at the boss room, just constantly sapping and seeing those emissaries, so they're not catching up on the rest of them. This is very well done. So this is how it looks like if they pull it off properly. Now, before with the Buccaneers, they were unfortunately they were breaking the CC too early because this artillery does not actually break the CC, and that's why they're trying to do this.
Yeah, I mean, just really, really nice clean play here coming out. And, you know, it's funny, we kept saying this pull in West last week was so scary, and I mean, it was, of course, with Raging, but even Raging would have been a non-factor here because they basically killed the mobs before they would have even had access to the tank, and he ran in maybe when they're about 5% HP with meta up, so wasn't a problem then, it wouldn't be a problem now, and certainly hasn't been, as they're at 82% trash. Really masterful execution here from Buffware and Nerve Rogue. Really nice and refreshing to see some different strategies coming in from these East teams that are very viable and very good looking. Now, these teams, of course, are running Alliance, so when we get those bolster casts coming in from the commander, they will not be able to dispel those. No one on the team can. Of course, they don't have the Arcane Torrent available either. One last chance here. Has popped their Bloodlust. Not really sure what's going on with their third rogue. Seems to be eating dust for quite a while, but you know, hopefully he comes back soon as they work on the second boss. Supremus, unfortunately, getting hit by one of those artillery strikes.
Yeah, Supreme is a rogue after all, so he's going to be fine as he has cheat death available and also cloak, so he can just use one of his 10 million defensive cooldowns or offensive cooldowns depending on what he chooses to do to survive this as they're trying to finish up this spotter here. Now, one more time I want to mention about this whole raging affix that the Western region had, which basically helped the Western region because of the spotter doing more damage. So these strategies that Buffware Nerve Rogue is doing here, they would actually be faster with the raging affix. So if you compare the times here from the Eastern region to the Western region, then you always have to keep in mind they would be faster if this spotter would be raging, because all these artillery strikes that you can see beautifully placed on these mobs with the fear on them would actually do a lot more damage with the raging affix here.
Yeah, no, really well played by them here. They finally do have to commit and grab aggro on them as Ching jumps in, lands an Infernal Strike, and of course uses his emote word to grab that aggro right away as the mobs were, the Sigil of Fear was wearing off of the mobs. But no problem, they reached their 100% trash, 15 minutes on the board. 2 deaths, had a bit of a hiccup earlier, but no problem for them as they run in and aggro Hadal Darkfathom, the third boss of the dungeon. Disaster striking here again for one last chance, though, as their healer goes down on the second boss, excuse me. Don't have a battle res available. The other rogue's been down the entire time. We've had a cheat death proc from Tay Rogue too. Can't exactly, there we go, 7% left on the boss right now, so they're gonna try to squeeze out and finish the encounter with just the two rogues and the warrior. They should be able to do that, which will of course checkpoint a res location for the healer, who is now resurrected, and they're now running over still as a 4-man group. Not sure what's going on there, but Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue just adamantly working on this third boss, already finished the trash too.
Yeah, and impressive to see that they also only have 2 deaths while also having all of this trouble with one of those pulls beforehand. Even with the trouble and the tank going down, they did manage to recover and not have a full team wipe. This is one of the strengths that really good teams have, that if something goes wrong, they are able to improvise and recover from those mistakes, which is very important because everyone is going to make mistakes at some point and things are not going to go as planned because there's just too many variables that can affect you in those dungeons. So if you have really good decision making and really good synergy with your group, if there's some sort of mistake or something that didn't go as planned, then you can still adapt and make sure you lose as little time as possible, which Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue showed that they can do here.
Supreme using his Cloak of Shadows there to greedily stay in on the boss and get as much damage as possible. We do know that big wave coming in is frost damage, so Cloak of Shadows completely negating that. We can see it be used at the top. Interesting that Tomboys didn't do the same thing. I'm not sure why. Maybe they're saving it for later, but he could have squeezed out just a bit more damage and killed this boss a bit earlier. But as we know, Nagura, I mean, these players at home likely have their second monitor open with the cast right now to hear not only our lovely voices, but to also make sure to keep an eye on where their opponents are in the dungeon. They likely know they're extremely ahead right now, and they're very comfortably going to take this map, unless, as you mentioned last time, they wiped several times at the end, which I don't see them happening with how composed they are on this map. One Last Chance has killed the second boss, 9 deaths on the board for them, and are doing a pretty substantial pull here, but too substantial as Shaurus, unfortunately, goes down, leading to their 10th death. He will be able to res right away because that is close to where the second boss got killed, but another death coming in on the healer, and this is just absolute disaster as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue rears up and gets ready to pull Vikoth, the final boss of the dungeon here in Siege of Borealis.
Yeah, one more thing to note here, the difference between Alliance and Horde is that they actually have a longer RP between this boss and the boss before. So the gate doesn't actually open for, I believe it's almost a minute. So a pretty long time that the Alliance team has to wait before the gate opens. So this is something you have to consider when you choose Horde or Alliance, because in the MDI, we changed it for the summer season. You can actually change your faction and your classes freely. So there's unlimited swaps going on. You can go from whole team Alliance to whole team Horde in a best of 3 series, so which is something we can see that one team is going Horde and one team is going Alliance, but both teams here choosing to play on the Alliance side. And one more thing to note about this last boss is that, again, they don't have the spotters available anymore because they changed it so the terrors and the demolishers are immune to the artillery damage.
Artillery, yeah, I mean, that was, you know, that was a bit overpowered, a bit questionable. I mean, you know, Blizzard had a good go around it. Not, you know, things like the spotter have been nerfed for boss damage, and we do know the Toldegor cannons have also been nerfed this season. Wanting players to, you know, actually do the dungeon themselves is not a bad thing to want from these teams. So we can see that right now here for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, which is dealing with the last demolishing of the platform, as we see that Kultiran NPC fix up the cannon, which he has recently done. They will kill this last demolishing off. We'll see exactly who goes in. Looks like Ching himself is the one to shoot the cannon to Vikoth, getting him down below that 2/3 health loss level, 27% remaining. He will double Infernal Strike over, and looks like the team is committing with Bloodlust to kill the final gripping in the back, while Ching just off-tanks the demolishing.
Yeah, so you have to be really fast if you focus the gripping terror, just because there's a time gate on those demolishers and the terror spawning. So if you have another demolisher spawn and there's, the tank is too far away, then melee has to pick it up and then he'll do less damage to the gripping. So very important they have the Bloodlust here, and they're gonna be done as they shoot this last cannon onto the boss, and they're gonna win against One Last Chance 2-0. Very clean runs by Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue here.
Very clean indeed, and they send their opponents to the lower bracket where they will have One Last Chance.
Oh, wow. I am shocked, Sloot.
And or appalled.
Oh, it's appalled with you. There's no or about it. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue handily takes the first series of the day. And Tettles, they put on a clinic with that Vengeance Demon Hunter Sigil of Misery. It's incredible.
Yeah, Sigil of Misery, of course, it's like a 20-second fear. That, coupled with like Sigil of Chains, they actually use that Vengeance Demon Hunter really well with how they ended up using the spotter on the back half of this instance. Overall, Buff War Nerf Rogue really showing why they are that #1 seed today.
It even goes to show, we mentioned a couple times about how, okay, Vengeance Demon Hunter Warrior, not that great against Necrotic. What are they going to be doing to bring it? And right here, Tettles is on display.
Yeah, so first off, Buff War Nerf Rogue just ends up dealing with like the first pack of trash and the first boss incredibly quickly, especially compared to One Last Chance. And then they just make their way into the rest of the instance.
This is
and
cool.
Right here, you actually do see the Sigil of Misery coming out. All of those spotters are feared. The whole entire group is like standing far enough back to where the Vengeance Demon Hunter ends up getting the spotter circle on him, and then he ends up dealing with like all of these mobs just by himself. Something that's also very cool here is how they actually ended up using Sap on this Emissary of the Tides whenever they ended up pulling all of Hadal's room, just getting all of that trash group, making sure that all of the Emissary of the Tides can actually make all the mobs CC immune, and it makes it very dangerous. Whereas Buff War Nerf Rogue, again, using that Sigil of Misery another time on all of these mobs here, just letting them get hit by the spotter, and then right before they ended up dying, they need to make sure that they tag them so that they actually can get the appropriate amount of count, because if they actually do die before getting tagged and they only die to the spotter, then they won't end up getting count. And then Buff War Nerf Rogue just ending up killing Vic Goth here. It's a pretty clean run from them overall. They did have a couple mistakes with one of their pulls just because of when the spotter ended up coming out, but overall, it was a pretty good run from them.
It was a great run, and even digging deeper into it, I love being able to see those extra clips that you had for us, Tettles, but we also have Method Dungeon tools to start breaking down those routes even further. What do you got for us on this one?
Yeah, so we have one of their more pivotal Sigil of Misery pulls. It actually comes out in this courtyard area after Dread Commander Lockwood. So basically they group up all of these mobs together, and then once they do get them grouped up, they end up dropping Sigil of Chains and Ursul's Vortex on them, just to make sure that they actually do stay close enough together. And then once the Ashvane spotter puts the debuff on a target, they end up walking that spotter circle on top of all of these mobs that can actually be killed by it, and then pull the Demolisher, start cleaving all the mobs down. This pull actually ends up becoming pretty dangerous for the whole entire group, and the reason for that being is just because of all the group-wide damage coming out, because they actually end up cleaving off and breaking the Sigil of Misery. So we can actually see the clip now in just a couple of seconds. So you actually see them grouped up, you actually see the Ring of Peace coming out also to help. And there's that Ursul's Vortex and Sigil of Misery that we keep talking about that's oh so pivotal. Everybody's standing on top of the mobs, waiting for that spotter to actually come out. And then they're going to be tagging that Demolisher here in just a couple of seconds. And this is why the pull actually becomes dangerous, because of how long it actually takes to set up, because Loda actually had the spotter on him just a little bit early. Then they end up breaking all those fears, and then all of this, like the water spray and all of the AoE from those monkeys actually end up making them lose a couple of deaths there. So if it was just like set up a little bit cleaner, that Vengeance Demon Hunter could have actually even saved them a little bit more time than what it already did.
Yeah, that was a fast and very clean run when they're not having to deal with any of the mobs, and it doesn't really make a large enough time difference, especially considering some of the melee AoE gets nerfed down as well. So with Buff War Nerf Rogue taking that first game in the first series of the day, they will be moving on into the upper semis, awaiting the winners between our next series between AAA and Hypers. Now, if you look right now, you see Team D with a 2-0 against Team 430. They did forfeit their first match of the day, but we are expecting to see them a little bit later in the lower bracket as they fight to stay into this into the game as we speak. So